Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Mentionables podcast. I'm Joel Furchess.
I'm Clinton Wilcock.
And I'm Caleb Johnston.
Today on the Mentionables, not enough scrying, creepy music, robes, and candlelight in your church? We'll give you step-by-step instructions on how to turn your church into a cult. Also, new atheism is getting pretty old by now. Is it still with us? And, if not, what has replaced it? But before we get into the serious stuff, let's play some games. With us once again is the bioethicist and worship leader himself, Clinton Wilcox. His contract with the Mentionables requires him to play a game of love song, worship song.
Is it a love song? Is it a worship song?
Now, Caleb's got a really impressive record with this game. Clinton had a gaffe in his first try, which I'm sure is super embarrassing for a worship leader.
Yeah.
So I thought I'd mention it.
A little bit, yeah.
All right, you guys ready for your lyrics?
Let's do it.
All right, first song. Trying times, disenchantment, then we become apprehensive. Who understands our plight? Who can answer the question why? I'm devastated. Unrest, no quietness. Oh, so weary, I don't want to fight. I need you to console me. Defeat I must deny. Hold me. Hold me, hold me in your arms. All right. So, love song or worship song? Caleb, what do you think?
I'm going to go worship song on this one, but this is probably the one I'm least sure about so far in the game.
Yeah. Well, you've got a good track record. All right, Clinton, worship song?
Yeah, my gut is telling me worship song, but it's one that I don't recognize. Now, I don't have, I'm not omniscient when it comes to worship songs, so it might still be one, but I'm going to go with love song on this.
Okay, we've got one love song, one worship song. Let's find out who's right. The song was Hold Me by Commissioned. In case you didn't know, that is a worship song.
I could sing of your love forever.
Okay, go ahead, Caleb.
Okay.
Strong track record is continuing.
I'm going to keep going with my gut then.
All right.
Maybe I'll start trusting mine.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do. All right, second song. In open fields of wild flowers, she breathes the air and flies away. She thanks him for the daisies and the roses in no simple language. Someday she'll understand the meaning of it all. He's more than the laughter or the stars in heaven, as close as a heartbeat or song on her lips. Someday she'll trust him and learn how to see him. Someday he'll call her and she will come running. She fall into his arms, the tears will fall down, and she'll pray, I want to fall in love with you, I want to fall in love with you, I want to fall in love with you, I want to fall in love with you. And that is the song. All right, let's have Clinton go first this time.
I actually know this song.
Oh, okay. Well, then stay out of
And
it.
so, okay.
All right. Oh, wait.
So I can answer after Caleb if you want.
Okay. Caleb, what do you think?
I am going to go love song on this one.
Okay. All right. And then, Clinton, you know the song. Do you actually know which one it is?
I do.
Okay.
I would say this is actually a bit of a trick question because the song is called Love Song for a Savior, so it could go either way. It's a love song to God, or you could consider it a worship song.
Okay, and that's by Jars of Clay. Jars of Clay kind of transitioned over into pop music, so they tended to do this thing where they made a song that could go either way. But secretly, that was a worship song.
I could sing of your love forever.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Caleb,
actually,
you still got a strong
I-
track record.
Yeah, I was a pretty big Jars of Clay fan back in the day.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, that's only my second miss in this game in our history of it, so
All right. Still a strong track
we'll
record.
see.
You've done a lot more than Clinton has.
Right.
All right, next song. Maybe I'm amazed at the way you love me all the time. Maybe I'm afraid of the way I love you. Maybe I'm amazed at the way you pull me out of time. You hung me on the line. Maybe I'm amazed at the way I really need you. Maybe I'm a man. Maybe I'm a lonely man who's in the middle of something. that he doesn't really understand. Maybe I'm a man, and maybe you're the only one who could ever help me. Won't you help me understand? Oh. All right, Clinton, you want to take the first stab at that one?
Let's have Caleb take it again, because I know the song.
Yeah, it's tough having you on.
Right.
All right, Caleb, yes, and then he's going to tell you whether you're right or not, I guess.
See, I was kind of up in the air on this one. Psychologically, I was leaning towards it being a love song, because you've already done 2 worship songs. But if Clinton knows it right off, that makes me think it could be worship again. So I'm going to flip the coin and go... I'm going to go worship song on this one.
Okay. Was he correct, Clinton?
Unfortunately, Caleb was incorrect. This is a love song. It's a song by Paul McCartney and Wings called Maybe I'm Amazed.
There you go. Maybe I'm Amazed really sounds like the title of a worship song to me.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it could be. I can see, some liberal church singing it as a worship song to God.
That's true. Or maybe one of those atheist churches.
Or, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, no, Caleb, in terms of these, I've done episodes where I've read nothing but worship songs, nothing but love songs. I try to mix it up so it's never predictable like that.
Right.
Clinton, you're bad luck for me so far.
Sorry.
So here's the final
It's all
song. Lyrics. Whether I'm right or wrong, there's no phrase that hits like an ocean needs the sand or a dirty old shoe that fits. And if all the world was perfect, I would only ever want to see your scars. You know they can have their universe. We'll be in the dirt designing stars. And you make me feel so beautiful. Nowhere else in the world I want to be. You make me feel so beautiful. End. Clinton, do you know this one?
I don't.
Okay, take a stab.
One or two of the lyrics kind of sounded familiar, but I don't know the song. So this will be a guess for me. I'm going to say love song.
Okay. Caleb, love song?
Again, I recognize some of the words, so that's making me want to lean love song as well. Okay,
so 2 love songs. The song is So Beautiful by Darren Hayes, and that is indeed a love song.
Oh, okay. So I did recognize it, because I do actually have a recording of that song. Savage Garden was kind of a guilty pleasure of mine.
Okay. Good deal. Good game, everybody. It's nice that you don't always get them right, because that means that I have made a good selection.
Yeah, there you go.
All right.
Perfect.
So that was Love Song, Worship Song. We're going to go ahead and do the thumbs up, thumbs down. We still have some statements left over from our last one. So let's do another one of those, and then we'll dig into the content. We'll start with something heavy. Behold, gentlemen, our first statement, which is, quote, "The fact that the Bible was written entirely by humans should make it impossible to believe any miracle claims described therein. Humans are known to lie, exaggerate, and be mistaken. All of these are more plausible explanations for the source of the miracles than actual events. So it's irrational to conclude that the miracles described in the Bible were true events." End statement. Gee, I can't imagine whether we're going to give that one a thumbs up or a thumbs down. All right. Everybody get that, or do you need me to kind of boil that down for you?
Actually, if you could, remind me again what we're giving a thumbs up or thumbs down to?
The statement that I just read. Do you agree with it or disagree?
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I think I got the gist of it pretty well, so I'm going to give that one a thumbs down.
All right. Caleb, thumbs up or thumbs down?
So with this statement, I think it's obviously a big thumbs down. think the statement itself relies on naturalism being true in order for the statement to really make any sense, because it's essentially stating that, no miracle observances are possible, and that, the only way we have miracle claims are from fallible people. So it's relying on the fact that there couldn't be a reliable observation of a miracle ever. But by nature, a miracle would, rule out naturalism in a sense, because in biggest sense of it, a miracle is something that's outside of what is possible within reality. So, just its reliance on naturalism alone is enough to say, no, even as a rather skeptical believer, I have to say that, if you rule out all possibility of miracles to begin with, you're asking for trouble in where your conclusions are going to lead.
Okay. So, of course, I'm going to give it a thumbs down as well. Rather predictable, I'm sure. I haven't read up too much on the defense of miracles. However, of course, I have written a book on the defense of Jesus and his resurrection, so I have at least one miracle which I have some strong certainty on that, it happens based on the evidence. And so, if there is one true miracle that I can appeal to with evidence, then I don't see it as being problematic to say that there were other miracles. Now, there's a atheist trope that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, you see something like that actually in the Bible, because if you look throughout the Bible, you see this trend where a prophet will come along, they'll say that they're speaking for God, and then they'll do some kind of what they would call signs or wonders in the Old Testament that indicate that they are in fact speaking for God. So they have made an extraordinary claim, which is that they've got the word of God they're delivering, and then they offer extraordinary evidence, which is the miracle. Now the problem that we have is that, if there's no observation of the miracle, then no skeptic is going to believe that the miracle ever happened, because that itself is an extraordinary claim. So it's sort of this endless cycle back that all of these are extraordinary claims and so forth. So, given my relatively certain position that Jesus rose from the dead, I think that we've got strong evidence that miracles are in fact possible. And since this is pretty consistent throughout Scripture, I'm not going to claim absolute certainty, but I'm fairly sure that miracles are possible even if the Bible was written by fallible human beings. Because even those people weren't convinced that, the parting of the sea was, the kind of thing that could happen. These were signs and wonders. These were things that were meant to show these people who were regular people, and they knew that, people can't get swallowed by a fish and live, and yet he did, and so this was a sign that they could believe that this person was speaking on behalf of a God who could perform these signs. Alright, that was a pretty long answer, but at any rate, the next one is fairly light in comparison to what we just did, and it is, quote, Tombstone is one of the greatest movies of all time. Alright, I will go first, I suppose. This is tough for me, because Tombstone was a great movie. It's hard for me to say if it was one of the greatest movies of all time, but since that's a pretty broad category, and you could have any number of movies in that category if you wanted to, I'll go ahead and give it a thumbs up. But I don't have a strong justification for that because I haven't really sat down and thought about all of the greatest movies I've ever seen. All right, who wants to jump in on that? Tombstone is one of the greatest movies of all time. Thumbs up or thumbs down?
You want to go next, Caleb?
Yeah, I'll dive in. Given that I'm rather rigorous in my ratings of movies, and this probably would still fall outside of the top 100, I'm going to give it a thumbs down.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll give it a kind of a tentative, unsure thumbs down. I've only ever seen Tombstone once, and it's got some, it's got great actors and just got some, some quotable lines in it. But it really wasn't one that made me want to watch it multiple times, even though I recognize that it was a very well done movie. And I can watch and enjoy westerns, but I'm really more of a science fiction kind of guy, and so those are the movies that I generally tend to gravitate toward. And I would probably put more science fiction films than westerns on, my subjective list of greatest films.
So, Clinton, what was your opinion of Cowboys versus Aliens?
Oh, yeah, I actually enjoyed that movie a lot more than I thought I was going to, because it sounds like like someone was kind of calling back to when they were 10 and used to play with their friends outside with their imaginations. But yeah, it actually ended up. I thought it was a pretty good film. Not great cinema, but definitely very entertaining. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was more like a popcorn movie where you probably would never go out back and listen or watch it a second time, but it was fun the first time.
Yeah, I mean, I might watch it if I had friends who said, "Hey, let's put this movie on and give it a watch." But yeah, probably not on my own.
Yeah, well, I read the graphic novel before I watched the movie.
Oh,
and there was zero connection between the two, except that there were cowboys and aliens involved.
Oh, yeah, I actually didn't know it was there was a graphic novel.
Yep. I would say it was based on the graphic novel, but again, there wasn't any connection between the two plot lines, so I don't know. All right, so the final one, and this is going to be another fairly heavy one. Socialism has never failed. The form it takes in practice is the result of achieving the objectives that it has based on its theological model of reality. I'm not quite sure what that even means. Any of you guys get that?
Vaguely. Not in a way that I could articulate it as somebody else, though.
All right, rereading it as I do, I would say that they're saying that there is a theological model of reality associated with socialism, and that it always achieves that goal. It always achieves its theological goal.
So maybe like atheistic socialism could fail, but a theistic one might not, that kind of thing? Or
well, I didn't write the question. I don't know. I just told you what it said.
Yeah.
All right, I'll take a crack at it. From what I know of socialism, and I haven't studied it extensively, there is this thought within socialism that you have the workers and you have the upper class, and that the workers need to own their own work within. And so under socialism, you have this concept that this whole idea of owning your work and society essentially being fair to all people is the idea. Now, I don't know if you could call that theological, because to the best of my knowledge, the whole idea was that theology, by which I mean religion, was a tool to oppress the people. It was one of these things that your upper class was using to kind of hold the worker down, and so you had to cast off theology in order to achieve the goal of the workers owning their labor and everybody getting an equal share. And so I guess what he's saying is that it always achieved that goal. Again, I don't know enough about the history of socialism to really say for sure, but to me that doesn't seem like a theology. It seems like a political statement. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a thumbs down.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give it a thumbs down also. I didn't understand the statement too much, but I'm just going to give it a thumbs down based on the fact that it seems a category error to talk about theology regarding socialism, because socialism is an economic system. It's not a worldview or anything like that. And so socialism, what it wants to achieve, or what is basically what any economic system would want to achieve, that you want to have citizens taken care of, and you want everyone to contribute to the society. So I would say that socialism in that respect has even if you don't think it's failed, it's a very much inferior economic system to capitalism. And if you're going to have everyone contributing, but the people who don't contribute as much are not going to, or, get more than what they actually earned, then that's less incentive for other people to work. And so socialism, just as an economic system, is inferior to capitalism. And so, so my thumbs down is just based primarily on thinking that it's just a category error to try and bring theology into socialism.
Now, I haven't studied it, like I said, but my concept, based on things I've read from various writers and philosophers and so forth, is that Marxism, if you can consider that the basis for socialism, is a worldview. There are certain elements of that flow into the whole concept of how we view reality and the way that we operate mentally and so forth. So
right.
I don't know enough about it to say that for certain. All right, Caleb, what do you think? Thumbs up or thumbs down?
Yeah, I'm hearing this one just a little bit different in terms of the logic side of it, but I'm going to kind of approach it the same way Clinton did, in that it seems that the implication being made is that once socialism actually occurs, once it reaches that apex as a system, then it cannot fail. However, it essentially rules out systems that are working towards a true socialism. So in that way, it's ruling out all these attempts beforehand that do often fail in terms of reaching that ultimate goal. And I think to say that only kind of that ultimate goal is true socialism, you're going kind of almost a no true Scotsman fallacy on this one.
Clinton, this is your second time on the show. Thinking of bringing a segment to us sometime in the future episode?
I will. Yeah, definitely. This one was kind of a last minute thing. We just talked about doing the podcast this morning, so I didn't really have much time to look for one. But yeah, definitely in the future, I will certainly intend to bring other topics.
Yeah, and that's fair. I mean, I contacted the Mentionables, asked if anybody was interested in doing an episode, and everybody's like, let's do it today. So it wasn't a whole lot of time to prepare.
I did try to do a quick search before we started the episode to see if I could find something, but nothing really came up.
That's fine. That's fair. All right, so for today, I'll start off and Caleb will close. That sound copacetic, Caleb?
Works for me.
Okay. My topic today has to do with the so-called new atheists. Clinton, you interact pretty heavily with atheist crowd. What do you think is the current status of new atheism?
Okay, yeah, I'm not. I wouldn't necessarily say I'm an expert on it, in that I don't really have like a bird's eye view of the entire, atheism like someone like William Lane Craig might. And because I've heard William Lane Craig talk about in his debates and lectures about how the new atheism is actually sort of dying off. So I don't know exactly how accurate that is, but the thought processes of the new atheism is certainly alive and well, at least in Facebook debate groups, because it seems like there's no shortage of atheists who not just disbelieve in Christianity, but basically act like Christians are just stupid people. There's absolutely no evidence for God. And so the only reason you would believe in God is because you're delusional. You get that kind of attitude pretty frequently, even on debate groups like the Unbelievable Facebook group, which is a Facebook group kind of run by the podcast, and the podcast usually has intelligent people on, and so I was expecting the conversation in that Facebook group to be a lot higher than the ones that I ordinarily encounter. But even the people in that group, the atheists in that group, were still kind of along the same simplistic level as most atheists that I encounter on social media. So at least on social media, I would say the new atheism is still quite alive and kicking.
Yeah, the Unbelievable Facebook group are some of the most lowbrow atheists I've interacted with.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, that's fair because William Lane Craig interacts with the academic level, whereas we are more feet on the ground types. So the people that we interact with are the followers of the academic level. They're the everyman that may have or may have not read The God Delusion and base their worldview on that. So,
Right, yeah.
I think New Atheism, from my perspective, New Atheism is the pop atheism trend more than it is the academic. But I suppose that depends on where what viewpoint you have, who you interact with.
Yeah.
Caleb, same question. What's the status of New Atheism?
I think we're largely seeing a watering down of it, in that the New Atheists were often watered down versions of earlier philosophers. But they brought in the science and, modern knowledge of psychology and stuff into incorporating in their beliefs and how they're accounting for other aspects of reality. And what we're seeing now, I think, is despite everything that's been brought to the table by New Atheism, we're seeing it being taken and really watered down, because the people I interact with in my day-to-day life as well as online, refer much more to people like Aaron Ra, or, the Amazing Atheist, or these different atheists online who have become these personas in putting out their YouTube videos. And in this generation, I think we're beginning to see a much more watered-down version of things with very meme-like arguments. As you and I have discussed before, Joel, it's a meme mindset at this point in terms of what arguments are out there. So, honestly, I think people would be less inclined to adopt atheism so quickly if they were looking at the New Atheist versus kind of the second generation New Atheism.
Okay. Well, before I lay my thoughts out on the subject, let me give our listeners a quick history lesson. So, the year is 2001. On September 11th, the well-known attack on the World Trade Center occurred, wherein some terrorists claiming Muslim connection hijacked some planes and crashed them into the iconic World Trade Center towers. Now, this brought to the surface a festering atheism in response, because the claim was essentially that these were men acting out of religious devotion. Allah told them to do it, so they did it, and this just demonstrated how dangerous the blind faith of religion was. So, shortly after this, we see all of these books coming out by Dawkins and Hitchens and the rest about how terrible religion is and how atheism was the way to go. And it caught on like wildfire. It spread all over the Western world, and atheist rallies and atheist conventions and atheist comedians and the works emerged from the shadow and become an overnight phenomenon. Now, of course, this was a reaction to Muslim terrorism, and they definitely spoke out against Islam, but the real target of their wrath was Christianity. So, I'd like to get your collective takes on this. Why do you think it was that New Atheism went straight after Christianity like it did?
Yeah, I think...
I'll jump in on that one.
Okay, sure.
Okay. I think one of the primary reasons is many of the New Atheists grew up in a Christian culture. So while radical Islamic terrorism may have been the motivation for kind of kicking some of this up, their own background was largely within a Christianized culture and Christian background. So it was an opportunity and kind of a trigger point, but of course the attack came largely based on the belief system they were most familiar with. And, Americanized Christianity was already becoming so watered down, largely shifting from the gospel to American values and morals and that sort of thing, that it became a very, in terms of just, I think, American Christianity was so watered down at that point, and with it being the background that a lot of these guys came from, that it became a very easy target for them to attack, rather than to, draw a target on their back by immediately going after Islam. It was much easier for them to kind of carry over some of the things they saw in Islam and try to apply it to, what they were familiar with, which was Christianity.
Okay. Clinton, any ideas about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a big part of it, the background that they came from. And I think probably this is just speculation, but I'm thinking that it's also possibly because of how large a number Christianity is in Western countries. And so it seems like it's, because you have people like Dawkins, who I believe is British, and you have other, guys like Lawrence Krauss and Christopher Hitchens and people like that Christianity is such a big influence in the cultures, not just in the past, but just it's kind of one of the largest one of the largest religions in the Western countries. And so even now they kind of feel that Christianity is what they should focus on, because that's kind of the culture in which they're trying to reach, essentially. And some of that might have been what echoing what Caleb said too, but those are kind of what I see things.
Okay. So what distinguishes new atheism from old atheism? So again, what's your take? What made new atheist what it was? Yeah,
and again, I'm not really like a history expert or history buff, but it seems like the new atheism and the old atheism is the belligerence factor that, like you were talking about after 9/11, it seemed like such a major enterprise that they had to engage in, that now they're kind of thinking, well, we can't just reason with them, because, they believe that there's no evidence or arguments for religion. So they believe that we weren't reasoned into our religion, so we can't be reasoned out of it. And so instead they're trying to bully religious people and insult them to give up their religion, just based on the fact that they don't want to be seen as idiots or delusional or anything like that. Whereas the old atheism would actually make intellectual arguments for their atheism, rather than the new atheists now, who just basically say then the default position is atheism. So I would say those two things are probably the major things that set new atheists apart from the old one. The new belligerism, trying to abuse, or I guess they would consider it disabusing, and now this new shift in redefining the term atheism to no longer be a positive claim that God doesn't exist, but instead now it's just a claim that no one can know, and that you have to prove God exists or you should be an atheist.
Okay. You more or less agree with that, Cal?
Yeah, I largely agree with that. I think kind of one of the other pieces there, along with that, is that can you repeat the question? I had a thought and then it kind of slipped away from me there.
Well, what makes new atheism? What defines it as a trend?
Oh, I think, okay. Thanks. That helped bring back the thought to me. Okay. I think the other piece there, in addition to what Clinton mentioned, new atheism is really trying to get this momentum shift to bring about a change in culture that drives secular humanism as a value system moving forward. I think that 9/11 was kind of a trigger for really bringing a lot of these thoughts to the forefront of people's mind, and so in new atheism, it's really an effort to really drive home a different moral system, and I don't think that differs a whole lot from atheism previously. We see largely the same thing with Nietzsche and with Bertrand Russell. In that, again, the idea is still there that this should be the moral and value system that drives culture forward at this point. So I think kind of the same driving momentum is there. But again, like what we talked about on the first question, the methodology is a little bit different.
Okay. So here's my take. There really wasn't such a thing as old atheism. At best, old atheism was either a smug, reserved person who didn't truck much with those dang Christians, or it was a so-called village atheist who liked to troll Christians by asking silly questions that Christians weren't prepared to answer. Things like, well, do babies just go to hell when they die? Now, new atheism describes this fad that started in the 2000s, where a vast number of people in America and Europe started reading pop atheist books and getting really angry at religion. I see two things that distinguish new atheism from old atheism. First, they were tremendously evangelical in nature, meaning that they were actually seeking out religious people and actually confronting them with all these questions they read in God is Not Great, seemingly with the goal of bringing them over to atheism or shutting them up. The other thing that new atheists brought to the table was a tremendous moralism that you didn't see in atheists. Your old light atheists tended to be absurdists or mildly nihilistic, or at best, humanistic. But the new atheists' main objection to religion was that it was downright immoral, and they were the new guardians of morality in the nation, trying to save the world from the evils of religion, which is something you had never really seen from atheists before, at least not this aggressively. And soon every atheist was an expert in Christianity, and they were really working hard to troll Christians. Now, I don't think this has gone away at all. I mean, all three of us are in a constant dialogue with atheists online that more or less stick with this same idea. So what am I saying has changed? So two things about new atheism, which have been there from the start, would be a hard commitment to the advancement of scientific rationalism to stomp down any remains of primitive superstitious thought, and then secondly, the establishment of a secular agenda. So, not just this separation of church and state, but total isolation of the church from any aspect of the state. So you see these campaigns to remove plaques with the Ten Commandments from various courthouses, or to disallow nativity scenes in public locations during Christmas, to have the phrase, "In God we trust," removed from the United States currency, and so forth. But religion isn't just another part of American life. It has actually served a function throughout our history. But when religion goes away, it leaves a vacuum in society, and something has to fill that vacuum. So look back at the classic moments of American history. You've got the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, or Dr. Martin Luther King's famous speech, or Neil Armstrong's speech at the moon landing, and all of these reference God, and this is what connected with people at the time. You connect your moment with God, and you've suddenly got given it true moral grounding, or a weight to that moment, and it sticks with people. Now we have the new atheism. They have a problem. If they aren't going to appeal to God, they have to connect with people and give weight to their moral standing that connects with people's ideas of reality and morality and so forth. So how do they do this? Before I give my answer, you guys tell me, when an atheist gets up and makes some kind of moral or dynamic appeal about the importance of a moment, where do they go to ground it for people? Or do they ground it at all? You might say they don't.
I'll dive in and go first there. What I largely see, at least in their attempt at grounding, is, again, it goes back to secular humanism. You know, how do we drive society forward without religion, as it's largely viewed as outdated and invaluable? So, you know, I think that the attempt at grounding is what's going to be a betterment and progression for society. How do we drive culture and society forward without these religious institutions that have helped to bring about, you know, the movement of society to the point that we are now in a lot of ways? So I think secular humanism is the attempt at grounding. What is best for human flourishing? Of course, there are plenty of problems with that not actually holding up as a firm grounding in any sense of the word. But I think that's where the attempts are largely placed.
Any idea, Clinton? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think my response would probably be pretty similar to Caleb's. You know, I know a number of atheists who are also secular humanists, and you know, believe that that's the best way to ground it.
Okay, so here's what what I've seen is that the primary way they tend to ground things is to say it's not what Christians believe. So what I'm saying is they don't ground it on the positive; they ground it in the negative. They actually need religion as the foundation for evil that they have to fight against in order to guide them morally. So it's like the opposite of what we would do. We would say that there's a standard of good and that we need to stick to this standard in order to reduce evil. And to me, it feels like a lot of the times they say there's this standard of evil, and so we need to do whatever it is that's opposite of that in order to achieve what's good. Now, what do you think? Am I wrong on that?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's that's a pretty good response. Obviously, atheists believe that there's a lot of evil with religion, which we saw obviously with 9/11.
So the statement, Caleb, was that they tend to judge morality in reaction to religion.
I can see where you're kind of coming from with it, but I'm not sure that I kind of fully agree. I mean, perhaps religion is somewhat a catalyst, or it's where they see a lot of the evil that's popped up in their own lives coming from. I'm not sure I agree with it as a grounding. I think their grounding may be a little bit closer to, a more generalized grounding that the desires we all have as humans. Our hierarchy of needs. I think their attempted grounding may be more along those lines. But I'm open to hearing you out on this. I'm still thinking about it, and looking forward to hear what your grounding for this is.
All right, well, I don't think that this is 100% of where they're grounding the morality. I would agree with that. But you do see some of this. So, and for instance that comes to my mind is that Bertrand Russell's daughter once wrote a biography of his life. And, she and he both kind of struggled with depression and, this kind of pursuit of happiness, and they never really nailed it down. And then one day he comes to her and says, he's discovered the secret, and he wrote a book about it. If you could somehow rid yourself of every vestige of the religious thought that kind of was the foundation of Western philosophy and morality and so forth, that this would bring about happiness. So you had to kind of dig down in your life, find out what kind of values and ideas you held that had ultimately traced back to the sort of Christianized, Judeo-Christian religious ideas, and kind of excise those from your personality and your thought process, and that would eventually bring you around to a status of contentment. So I wouldn't say it's 100% of what they ground on, but I often find that, they have this attitude of, well, what would a religious person say? Because I'm just going to do the opposite of that. And you see this kind of thing in politics, if nothing else.
Yeah. Now, was Bertrand Russell's daughter an atheist also?
Well, she began that way. She eventually ended up converting to Christianity.
But she was an atheist when she had this discussion with her father?
Yes, she was. So, no, she became a Christian in adult life. Several years.
Interesting.
After, during college or thereafter. I can't remember exactly, but at any rate, I think it's fair to say that New Atheism has always been political more than philosophical. So I might be wrong about that, but
yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that, because there's very little philosophy among the New Atheism. Whenever I think of Richard Dawkins, his book The God Delusion, where he attempted to do philosophy, I always think about atheist philosopher Michael Roos, who has a video on YouTube where he basically said that Dawkins makes him embarrassed to be an atheist because the God Delusion was so simplistic.
yeah.
And so there's a lot of political moving going on in the New Atheism, and they try to do philosophy, but they're so they tend to be so terrible at it, and they don't recognize that what they're doing isn't really good philosophy. It's just really bad. Like Richard Dawkins tries to dispatch with Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways in 3 short paragraphs. And he just kind of hand waves them away, despite the fact that Thomas Aquinas wrote volumes and volumes of books where he justifies his philosophy. And even when you have scientists like Lawrence Krauss, who basically relies on a very peculiar definition of nothing in order to prove that something can come from nothing.
Yeah.
Or you have someone like the late Stephen Hawking, who basically wrote in one of his books that philosophy is dead. So I would say that there's very little philosophy being done amongst new atheist academics. Now, of course, there are atheist philosophers, but I don't know if they'd necessarily be considered part of the new atheism.
Yeah, I think there's this attempt to shut down philosophy in many atheist circles. I can remember this moment, I used to follow an atheist show that has been shut down now. And in one episode, it was a live recording of this speech that one of the panel on that show had given. And so he gives this sort of philosophical / theological argument against God at an atheist conference. And then during the Q&A section, there were a number of atheists that kind of sort of put him down or berated him for using a philosophical argument, because the only way to determine what's true is through scientific sort of verificationism. So they really didn't like the fact that he was bringing a philosophical argument to them. And, I mean, since you've got this sort of movement, a scientific verificationism, which states that the only way to know what's true is to ground it in kind of a scientific, and they're moving in that direction because I don't think they like allowing metaphysics to get a foot in the door, because that's problematic if they're going to say that matter and energy are the only things that are extant in the universe.
And I think actually it's not so much an inability to do philosophy, which I think many of them have that ability, especially in the second generation we're seeing. I think the problem is with an ability to do honest philosophy, because a lot of the philosophical conclusions of atheism in terms of how that practically plays out in life, really go down some dark roads, that include nihilism as being a very reasonable conclusion to an atheistic worldview. And I think it's a disillusionment that, this is not the path they can practically go down is why they avoid it so much.
Yeah, especially if they're going to bring moralism into it, if they're going to attack Christians and their idea of God on moral grounds, can't go down the route of nihilism, because that just undercuts the whole premise in the first place. But
right.
At any rate, New Atheism starts as a reaction against this attack on America, allegedly by Muslims. But the American president at the time happens to be a Republican, and he gets us into a war that everyone hates. So, classically, Republicans are associated with Christians, and there are segments of society that really see the two as identical. Christians are Republicans, and Republicans are Christians, full stop. So I think it's fair to say that American politics was a big driver of the New Atheist movement. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, I think so too.
All right, so here we are 18 years later, and the New Atheists have a problem. Despite their largely leftist ideology, their ranks are still heavily white and heterosexual men. And I don't want to say that all of them are like that, but it still kind of heavily trends in that direction. And so this is a problem for progressives. Now, I think it's fair to say that progressives aren't largely Christian to any degree, and they aren't particularly fond of the religious right. But they aren't all New Atheists. They are probably composed of a broad mix of apatheists, which means people who don't know or don't care, but still don't like evangelicals, and then maybe some New Ageists in there, possibly liberal Christians, and now Muslims. But now some of the things that have been part of the New Atheism are really starting to chafe as the flow of politics is progressing over the decades. And these have many within the group questioning the movement as a whole. By far the most embarrassing of these is the current political climate. Here we have New Atheist movement, which was essentially born out of what would now be termed Islamophobia. This is a line of reasoning that famed atheist frontman Richard Dawkins is apparently still holding. He's been quoted as saying that he has mixed feelings about the decline of Christianity because, quote, insofar as Christianity might be the bulwark against something worse. He says that, quote, there are no Christians, as far as I know, blowing up buildings. I am not aware of any Christian suicide bombers. I'm not aware of any major Christian denominations that believe the penalty for apostasy is death, and so forth. End quote. This kind of rhetoric is evidently embarrassing to some who wish to hold atheism up proud. Atheist writer Jeff Sparrows says, quote, "How did a movement ostensibly full of progressives end up so identified with writers who sound less like incarnations of pure reason and more like your Islamophobic uncle after he chugs his sixth pint?" End quote. Another trend within the New Atheist movement is the threatening treatment that women within the movement have received. So a few years ago, an atheist writer, Mark Oppenheimer, did an expose titled, "Will Misogyny Bring Down the New Atheist Movement?" He talks about some very chauvinistic behavior at skeptical conferences. He talks about cyberbullying of women and feminists, and this is all while New Atheists pay lip service to the absolute sanctity of women's rights, and this is pushing women away. So we have this thing where what's-his-face divorces his wife because he's decided that he's polyamorous.
Yeah, that's Richard Carrier.
Yeah, Richard Carrier, thank you. And then in my research following these Christian converts to atheism, there's this woman who, fairly young, and she does a YouTube channel which is very popular. And after her sort of rise to public eye, apparently Richard Dawkins starts flirting with her, and she's in her 20s, and he's in, his 70s? And this was pretty embarrassing for her. So, anyway, Oppenheimer, the guy who wrote this article, says, quote, "For the past several years, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and online forums have become hostile places for women who identify as feminists or express concern about widely circulated tales of sexism in the movement. Some women say that they are now harassed or mocked at conventions, and the online attacks, which include Jew baiting, threats of anal rape, and other pleasantries, are so vicious that 2 activists I spoke with have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder." End quote. Now I want to be fair here. New Atheism isn't just a bunch of angry knuckleheads out for blood. They're actually considered intelligent, upstanding people within the movement. And now these are the people who are starting to express concerns for the way the movement has been trending. There are people who are by no means becoming religious, but they are starting to be critical of the New Atheist movement and trying to maintain a reasonable stance against religion without being associated with bad thinking or bad behavior. You guys ever meet anybody like this? You know, actual practical and reasonable atheists that wouldn't engage in that kind of thing?
Once in a while, I encounter an atheist like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say I encounter them all the time.
Okay.
Lots of them.
Yeah, there you go. And, you know, I mean, the atheists that we've had to our conferences for debates seem, you know, they were reasonable, friendly people that we enjoyed hanging with.
But yeah, I did a debate with Matt Dillahunty a couple years ago, I think it was now. And yeah, I'd always heard a lot of really negative things about him. But he actually ended up being a really nice guy. So yeah, they are out there. And maybe I just need to run in the circles that Caleb is running in to encounter more of them.
Yeah. All right. So here's the complaint you're hearing from these more reasonable atheists. They're recognizing that New Atheism tends to caricature and blindly attack what it marks as a target without any attempts to understand or interact with the ideas. This kind of torch and pitchfork waving tendency has a fundamentalist, almost religious zeal to it, which is exactly what these thinkers are attempting to escape in the first place. So there's this article I read. It was titled, "Can We Save Atheism from the New Atheists?" And it was by a guy named Jeff Sparrows. And in his article, he highlights the classist and racist problems within the New Atheist assumptions. And he writes, quote, "You don't have to be a believer to see that religion genuinely offers something to its adherents, often when nothing else is available, and that it what it provides is neither inconsequential or silly. By contrast, the new atheists engage with religion purely as a set of ideas, a kind of cosmic rulebook for believers. On that basis, it's easy to point out inconsistencies or contradictions in the various holy texts and mock the faithful for their gullibility. That's the basis of the obnoxious behavior that so many people now associate with New Atheism, a movement too often exemplified by privileged know-it-alls telling the poor that they're idiots, end quote. So another atheist had some similar concerns with the lampooning of religious behaviors by an atheist community that makes no attempt to understand them. He says, quote, "I find its conception of religion so contrary to anything that I would have said about my faith in earlier years, that I find myself no longer able to associate myself with this movement. Much that new atheists say about religion is simply so much straw," end quote. MacDonald really doesn't like this tendency within the movement for the atheists to dehumanize religious people and to classify their beliefs not so much as a worldview, but as a pathological disorder. He says, quote, "One is reminded of George Orwell's 1984, or the common practice of the Soviet Union of placing dissidents in psychiatric hospitals. There is a deeply threatening aspect to the belief that those whose ideas you oppose are somehow mentally ill or victims of pathological ways of thinking," end quote. So MacDonald isn't abandoning atheism per se, but is placing distance between himself and the new atheism. He says, quote, "New atheism is quickly attaching itself to beliefs that are as dogmatic and irrational as many religious dogmas, and to a kind of ideological certitude that may be as dangerous as the ideologies of the past that caused so much harm," end quote. Now, in a recent episode we did of the Mentionalist podcast, I replayed an interview I had of my research of Christians who became atheists, and I will say that you do see them dragging fundamentalist attitudes from their religious days over to their atheism. A complaint I see a lot with these deconverts is that Christians have this sort of absolute certainty about their doctrines that can't be questioned. And here McDonald's is complaining that you see the same kind of absolute certainty on the new atheist side, which to me suggests that the ranks of the new atheists are infused with a large population of former fundamentalist Christians. So would you agree with that? That, you see a lot of fundamentalist Christians transfer over to atheism?
Yeah, I would agree almost universally with that. I think that, and we've discussed this some in the past, but I think almost all the atheists I have spoke with have come from a background that not necessarily just Christian, but some form of religious fundamentalism is at play in almost everybody I've talked to. It's very rare you'll run into someone who hasn't come from a less fundamental background per se.
Yeah, I would also agree with that. And Caleb was saying, I have talked to a lot of atheists who also come from fundamentalist backgrounds, oftentimes from Christianity, and so the atheist that comes from that religious background will often tell the Christian that's debating and discussing with them that he came from a religious background, so he knows the Bible. And often when you have discussions about whether or not there are contradictions and or errors in the Bible, their interpretation of the biblical passage is usually on par with what you get from the fundamentalists of religion. Genesis 1 can only be taken as 24 literal days. Other passages can only be taken in one specific way, and they don't really put in the research to understand what the author originally meant when he originally wrote it. So I think that probably shows that they often come from that fundamentalist background because they believe, just like Christian fundamentalists do, that there's only one specific interpretation of Scripture.
Yeah, I see this where, I'll read these 10 questions to stump Christians or like these arguments that I have online, and they just immediately jump in assuming that I hold all of the beliefs that they held back when they were a Christian. And some of the beliefs they come up with, I don't even recognize. but they assume that we all believe the same thing.
Right.
Yeah, I think you'll see, too, for anybody who's been following the recent drama between Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy and Aaron Ra, and Eric Hernandez has been involved as well in trying to give Aaron a reasonable and, actually true to Christianity definition of faith from a biblical standpoint. He still holds to this view of faith in terms of how he interprets that in a very Mormon sense of the word. The definition he hangs on to is clearly, left over from his Mormon background.
Yeah. Well, okay. So in this article titled, "What Scares the New Atheists?", an atheist named John Gray points out that atheism in and of itself has no inherent values. And in the past, atheism has dogmatically championed such causes as racial superiority by Ernest Haeckel or eugenics by Julian Huxley. And Gray says, none of the divergent values that atheists have from time to time promoted has an essential connection with atheism or with science. How could any increase in scientific knowledge validate values such as human equality and personal autonomy? The source of these values is not science. In fact, as the most widely read atheist thinkers of all time argued, these quintessential liberal values have their origins in monotheism. End quote. Now, Gray's not the only atheist thinker saying this. Another atheist, Franz de Waal, wrote an article titled "Morals Without God," and he says, quote, "Even the staunchest atheist growing up in Western society cannot avoid having absorbed the basic tenets of Christian morality. Our societies are steeped in it. Everything we have accomplished over the centuries, even science, developed either hand in hand with or in opposition to religion, but never separately. It's impossible to know what morality would look like without religion. It would require a visit to human culture that is not now and never was religious, and such cultures do not exist, and that should give us pause." End quote. So there you have it. There's some issues going on in the ranks of the new atheists 20 years after it started. So the question becomes, where is it headed from here? I definitely don't think we're due for another great revival, but okay, so what do you think is going to happen down the road with atheism on its current trajectory?
I mean, I'm not really sure.
Okay.
It's going to continue, being it's going to continue being a minority, I would say. I don't think it's ever going to enjoy status as for lack of a better word, a religious majority. But, I think that they'll, I don't see the name calling or the view that religious people are delusional, all that stuff. I don't really see that going away anytime soon.
Any thoughts, Caleb?
Yeah, I don't know. I could continue to see this kind of meme culture and attitude continue to progress. But, my hope would be that we'll at least have some more serious thinkers arise who are willing to look at this somewhat seriously and in a comparative way to see the value in religion again, even from a purely social standpoint. I think we'll see a friendlier atheism develop in a lot of ways in the future. Could be wrong with that, but that's kind of my guess at this point.
So here's what I think. I think what you're going to see is a transition from this philosophical and scientific objection, which I think was sort of the rise, of the new atheism, was this real call back to scientism. But what I think is going to end up happening is that you're going to see a transition over to purely political objections to religion. Sort of a, get on board with whatever the current sexual ideology or, cultural ideology is, or just abandon it entirely. And, all of the objections are going to transition not from science, but over to politics. And I already think we're seeing that. I've rarely been to a conference, an apologetics conference, or listened to some kind of apologetics call-in show where the conversation of homosexuality or, racism or something hasn't come up. Even when the conference had nothing to do with those topics, that ends up coming into the question and answer, or whoever calls in. And this just seems to be what we're transitioning over to. Like, we had mentioned the Unbelievable Facebook group earlier. I would say that the posts on there which are political in nature largely overcome the ones that are scientific or religious in nature. It just seems what we're going to end up transitioning over to, and these sort of scientific objections are going to be left in the dust. All right.
That sounds plausible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my guess. I would think, Clinton, that you would be on the forefront of that one because that's sort of where you travel in your apologetics.
Yeah, I unfortunately don't get out to many conferences, at least not as many as I would like to. I'm actually going to be giving doing a breakout session at a conference in New Orleans in January. But I do give talks at smaller venues like philosophy clubs and things like that, and so occasionally atheism even gets brought up at my talks occasionally, because there's this big kind of this assumption that bioethics in general, but certain ones like abortion more specifically, there's kind of this assumption that it's religion versus atheism, that if you're religious you'll be against abortion because you hold to the sanctity of life, and if you're an atheist you won't, because you don't believe life is sacred or special in any sense. So even when I give talks on bioethics, I do occasionally get questions about religion as well.
Yeah. So, all right. So that was my segment. It's your turn, Caleb. How do I start my own cult? Halloween is coming up, and I've already ordered the robes. If you can somehow integrate Cthulhu into it, I'm on board. But if ritualistic suicide is involved, I'm going to jump ship.
Oh, there you go.
Well, it certainly could be, but you probably won't see it coming until it's too late. Mm. So, with this, we're going to talk about starting a Christian cult. And by that, what I mean is that there are many cult groups out there who would consider themselves Christian in a loose sense of the word. But before we kind of dive into exactly what I mean by that and how we're actually going to start this cult, I want to make something really, really clear. Despite the satirical nature of that title and kind of the approach we're taking to looking at this today, the lines of thinking and the methodologies that we're talking about are really dangerous. These groups often put people's life in life or death situations, and new or immature Christians, as well as non-believers, could very easily get sucked into some of these groups because they are very emotionally manipulative in a way that welcomes people in and it gives them a place to belong. So, while we're looking at this from a very satirical kind of take on it, use the kind of stuff we're talking about today to assess groups you're involved with, because I think a lot of these kind of same methods and issues can even pop up within solid biblical churches if a small group or a particular Bible study veers off in a dark direction thanks to a charismatic Bible study leader. You can even see this kind of pop up on a micro level within churches who are solid on their theology. So I think you should, use a lot of what we talk about and reflect on it, whether, you're being influenced in certain ways. And certainly, if you're part of a group that's maybe already considered fringe or cult, then, at least take some time to research and spend some time on looking up why people believe that. But anyway, when kind of diving into this, and when I say Christian cults, are there any particular groups that would come to mind for either of you?
So like cults that specifically spring out of Christianity?
Yeah, I think that would be a reasonable way to phrase it.
Okay, and what? How do you define cult? Like, what do you have in mind when you say cult?
By cult, I'm taking kind of a loose definition here in terms of I'm looking at groups that particularly manipulate and control people. So they're looking to control how you think, how you act, your behavior, as well as your interactions with other people. So, in general, that's really what I'm looking at here, is groups that are controlling in every kind of sense of the word. So,
yeah, because the two that immediately
groups like Waco are kind of obvious, but
well, yeah, because like the two that immediately spring to mind are Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormonism. But I'm not sure if they would specifically be considered cults in the way that you're using the term.
Right, and I think those actually are two very good examples that do fit in here. Now, what they had at their origins was kind of that charismatic leader that focused on thought and behavior control, and it's developed over the years into something a lot more organizationally structured than on a specific leader. So a lot of people do view them as a religion versus a cult or even a denomination of Christianity. But I think, as we get into this a little more, it will kind of flesh out why I would put them in that group of cult. How about you, Joel? Any other ones that jump to mind?
Well, I don't know. I don't keep up with all the various religious movements enough to give you a title, but I could definitely say some things that I've heard, some groups I've heard, and kind of define what it is that they do, and, that makes them sort of cultish in nature. So, recently I was listening to a podcast where they were interviewing this girl who had come out of this kind of religious movement where she was brought into this training where she was supposed to go out and basically minister to these people, and I mean, the ministry sounded solid insofar as that they were serving the people and bringing food to them and so forth, these very poor people, but in so doing, they were also kind of evangelizing them in a way that involved these sort of ritualistic things. It wasn't salvation through faith by the grace of God. It was more these works-based things. And, I can identify particular behaviors that seem very cultish in churches. I mean, you can look at these. Obvious examples would be these extreme charismatic movements where you're getting up or speaking in tongues and handling snakes and so forth that have little to do with the gospel and more to do with these sort of ritualistic and works-based elements. So I would say getting out there and focusing on the works that you do, the very particular activity or ritualistic things, it is slipping in the direction of cult. Now, what we want to do is we want to talk about the gospel. If we're not talking about the gospel, and we're using the Bible in this sort of numerological system to dig out particular weird truths about the universe, and you have to engage in these various rituals more than you do preaching the gospel, that's slipping in the direction of a cult.
Right, and I would agree. And rather than kind of place a lot of labels out there here early in this, I'm going to give kind of a short list at the end here that touches on some of that. But, if any of our listeners are perhaps involved in one of these groups, I'm going to save that till the end because I want people to seriously consider some of these things we talk about along the way. But you've both touched on a lot of those core characteristics that kind of really show how fringe some of these groups are, and that's really one thing I want to focus on is that distinguishing factor between a denomination within Christianity and a actual Christian-based cult.
Cal, I'm going to jump in here real quick.
To really focus on that. Yeah, dive in.
Okay. So now that I've been thinking back over it, I've been doing these research of Christians that became atheists, and one jumps to mind is this lady who was involved in this movement called the Quiverful movement. Are you familiar with them at all?
Yeah, I've been accused of being a part of it a few times, given my poor kids.
All right, so you know what I'm talking about, but I'll just do a brief summary for the listeners. Basically, the idea, the title, Quiverful, is a reference to some scripture that says that, children are a blessing, and, blessed is the man who has his quiver full of them. The idea being that they're like arrows, and you have a quiver full of arrows, and it's just kind of a blessing. And so the whole idea is that you just have as many kids as you want, or as you possibly can, and that you're going to end up evangelizing the world by Christians having more children than non-Christians. And so the lady that I listened to, among the things that she did was that she insisted that her husband take over the finances and get out there and do the work, and that she had to submit to her husband, and that she then had to, they used no sort of protection or whatever, so when they had sex, she could get pregnant, and that was the whole, have as many kids as she possibly could. And there were other elements of it as well, just sort of this stringent lifestyle that you had to pick up, and you had to isolate yourself from the world. So she kept changing churches because she, kept going to churches she thought were getting too worldly. And eventually they started their own church because she couldn't find a church that was isolated from the world enough. And they would homeschool all the kids so the kids wouldn't be exposed to the world and just sort of shut themselves out from all surrounding influences, so that, the kids wouldn't have any exposure to anything that was remotely unchristian and might sway them in the other direction. And so I would call that cultish. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm there with you on that. I think that certainly leans that direction in terms of the thought and behavior control. Anything you want to add there, Clinton?
Nothing specifically as far as the definition of cult is concerned. I did think of another cult which might qualify, but it's more of an extreme example.
Cults are kind of extreme.
The one that came to mind after I thought of the Jehovah's Witnesses was the Jonestown cult.
I'll address that a little bit because it's interesting. First of all, the Jonestown suicide thing happened the year that I was born, and every time I get one of those, little things that say, in the year that you were born, and it gives all the significant events, Jonestown's at the top of that list.
Well, that's an uplifting one for your birthday.
All right, but having said that, it's interesting because I always thought that as well, but when I studied Jonestown, he actually, it started as a church, sort of a biblical thing, and then over time he started getting very hostile to the Bible until, what I read was that at one point he threw the Bible down on the ground and said that he was going to destroy it, and he ended up following more of a communistic sort of socialist thing, and that's why they went off and got their own compound, because he was going to establish a communistic sort of paradise, but that didn't go so well in the end.
Right.
Yeah, and he's actually one of the first people I was going to kind of mention in this, but kind of before diving into that, the last thing I kind of wanted to draw out a little bit was one of the key differences between Christianity and these cults are that one of the cores of biblical Christianity is the freedom that is brought to us through Christ. We have freedom from sin. We have freedom from shallow rules and religious laws, freedom from man-made regulations. Freedom is a big part of true biblical Christianity. And Christians are free to express differences that are not critical to the faith. We see that the apostles had differences at times that caused them to part ways. So freedom is a core aspect of biblical Christianity. And what we see with a lot of these groups is that freedom's completely pulled away So much so that we do get to something like Jonestown eventually, where people are willing and to go through with a mass suicide and killing their own children, and it's really awful. But there's a key distinction there too, in terms of we're not pulling out a no true Scotsman fallacy here to say that, well, these cults aren't really Christian. There are actual distinguishing factors there that qualify them as cults because of the way they're controlling individuals within the movement. As well as when we look at that Christian freedom that is there among Christianity. When I'm talking about Christianity, I'm not talking about a given denomination. And these exclusions even apply to some rare individuals I've met within some of these groups that still hold to biblical Christianity in terms of believing the gospel to be true, that Christ was died and resurrected for their sins. And while they have some very mixed up ideas, I still believe they are part of the Christian church. When I say the word church and refer to Christianity, I'm not talking about a building or a group or any kind of more specific label. I mean believers in the gospel. And that crosses many denominational lines. And I think we have some true believers who are in these cults, who are part of the universal church. But what we're going to kind of look at from here on out is looking at how we would actually start one of these if we were to try and take things the direction that many of these leaders have in the past. And that's one of the first things we would need. We're going to need a really charismatic leader who can, at the very least, garner people's trust. And I think we already touched on that with Jonestown a little bit. Would either of you like to dive in more on Jim Jones or maybe another cult leader you're familiar with?
Well, I don't know that many cult leaders, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with several cults. I'm not necessarily still familiar with the inner workings of those cults. Like there is there's that cult, the Heaven's Gate cult, which believed that they were going to ride to heaven on a comet. Yeah, and I'm trying to think of what some of the ones that I've heard about. Because Jonestown and Heaven's Gate are like the two big ones that I'm familiar with, aside from the two that I mentioned at first, Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons. Other than that, I think that's probably the extent of the cults I know about.
Any other thoughts, Joe?
No, that's about it for me.
Okay, well, without kind of revealing a full hand yet, I do want to say that a lot of cults start off this way and kind of shift. But what we would kind of want is to get somebody who garners people's trust in a way that is very welcoming. The group back in the 50s, not 50s, it was 70s, I believe, that was the Children of God. And this group, again, had a very charismatic leader who everyone called the Father. And, he was regarded as the patriarch in this ultimate family society they had going. And, his charisma and trust that he got from people in terms of the faith they put in him allowed him to do some awful things. And, so much so that they would follow commands to do outreach as very similar to what we would see with the Jehovah's Witnesses, going door to door, but they called it flirty fishing, and essentially they would try and find young, wealthy men. Women would show up at their door and essentially offer to sleep with them to get them to join the cult. So, it was this leader's guidance that led to practices like this, and he had a very deviant sexual life in terms of he was certainly a pedophile. And carried on a number of relationships with children in the group and family members, but the trust that he garnered from people enabled him to do such a thing. And a lot of leaders are a little bit more subtle than kind of the behavior route he took. Jim Jones started off, as you mentioned, in a church, but he led some very positive revolutions in terms of the racial approach. This was at a time where race tensions were very, very high in the U.S., and he encouraged that, his group essentially do away with racial boundaries, which, as a Christian, I certainly see that as a really, really positive thing in that regards. But again, he used a lot of this momentum from things that people saw as good to shift around in a way of controlling behavior that was not beneficial in the end. Now, one of the other key things that we're going to need in starting this cult is we're going to need to kind of build a language all our own. I'm not talking about an actual language here, but what we want to do is redefine words so that they have different meanings and significance than they do for most Christians or the general public at large. Does that kind of ring any bells with your experience with any of these groups?
Well, I obviously haven't been part of any of the groups, but I'm familiar with cult techniques, with the brainwashing techniques and so forth with cults. So I couldn't put my finger or name any of these cults, but I'm familiar with the techniques that they use. And yeah, obviously what you just mentioned is part of it. You start your own culture, which is completely separate from the outside culture, so that, again, you speak a different language as far as the terms that you use and the definitions associated with those terms. And I mean, you see this in Christianity in general. We have a specific language within the church that those outside of the church wouldn't necessarily recognize or understand the meaning that we use when we talk about these things. And that's problematic because the true Christian church is evangelical, or should be evangelical in nature. And so there's this sense in which we should be reaching out to the culture around us. But in cults, it's a little more pronounced, and it's intentional. You have to create a language. Isolationism is another form of cults. Technique of cults. You kind of try to keep your members away from the outside culture and insular to just themselves. And, you mentioned flirty fishing. Sexuality is another thing that you see in cults, especially the cult leader. Understandably, if he's got a clinch on the idealism and the behavior of the cultists, he's going to try to get as much out of that as he can. So, and that's another form of cults, is that there's sort of a charismatic leader. And you see this in Mormonism. They've always got a prophet that's sort of leading, and he's got sort of power of veto over the Book of Mormon and everything else that they hold. So he can pretty much rewrite Mormonism if he chooses. So isolationism, create your own culture and language, charismatic leader. These are all things that you see in cults.
I've often kind of wondered what it would be like if an Orthodox Christian just kind of infiltrated Mormonism and kind of went incognito and tried to get elected as a bishop, and then really tried to change their views. I've often kind of wondered about that kind of thing.
Yeah, Mormonism is pretty tight about that kind of thing. It would be difficult to go in and change those things because those traditions are really carved in stone, and they would kick you out if you were doing anything against that kind of thing. The only way that you could really get there is to go in and eventually become the prophet, because the prophet has the authority to kind of rewrite the rules. But that would take a lot of doing.
Right. Yeah, but I'm kind of in the same situation as Joel. I'm not really an expert on cults, but I have done, I did like a study on cults with the youth group at one point, and so we talked about the things like the brainwashing and controlling who your friends and family are and things like that. So I'm a little bit familiar with the tactics they use, but not really so much so that I know the inner workings intimately with these cults.
Okay, and what we see, kind of the interesting thing about some of these Christian cults, are the subtle twist and changes make in language that twist the scripture just enough so that someone who's unfamiliar with Bible reading and Bible study can very easily see this as a reasonable interpretation. And with a lot of the language used by these groups, for example, I mentioned earlier in our conversation about R and Ra's definition of faith. That's one thing. The Mormons feel burning in their bosom. That is a faith that's a feeling. It's not a traditional Christian understanding of faith being a action. It's actually a feeling. And so we see these little subtle changes within these groups that manipulate what the meanings of words are. And so it makes an atmosphere that is, like Joel mentioned, a completely new culture. And that kind of leads to kind of the next thing we would want to do here is if we were really to start one of these groups, we would want to reinterpret the Bible in a way that is close enough that most Sunday Christians won't pick up on the deceptions we're throwing out there. So in a conversation, for example, with Jehovah's Witness elders, many Christians would not be able to pick up on the distinctions that they make about Jesus within their theology. They shy away from mentioning that, no, he's not God, he's actually the Archangel Michael, which of course is significantly different than an Orthodox Christian view of who Jesus really is. And so they integrate just enough changes to make subtle differences in theology. And a lot of these come up particularly with, the two we keep going back to over years and years and years of teaching within the group. These views become more and more twisted from what Scripture actually is. And some build in, their own new book or doctrine to alter that and make these changes. Once you kind of have that foundation, though, a good charismatic leader, a language all your own, and you've got your Scripture reinterpreted the way that you think it best is, then you want to really enforce rules that control behavior and let people think that if they do A, then it will result in good thing B, or if they do C, it will result in negative consequence D. It's all about rule enforcement, much the way it was with the Pharisees in Jesus' day. It's not about the ideas that were behind many of these rules. It's all about you gotta follow these rules to a T, or you're going to face the consequences of that. And I think where we see the greatest challenge with this in cult groups is in their doctrines of hell. It's always interesting when encountering a new cult or group to look into what their doctrine of hell actually is. They either tend to eliminate it entirely to make their belief system more appealing by, in essence, trying to do away with the problem of hell. So if we were to continue to build up this group we're starting, how could we alter our doctrine of hell to be something that would reinforce people staying within the group?
Well, before I give a full answer to that, I just wanted to say that my impression of cults is that they really proof text from the Bible. They focus in on one or two passages, and they build their entire doctrine around those, and then the rest of that is just, white noise. They don't really go to the rest of the Scripture. And they tend to also control the Scripture so that they discourage members from really digging into doctrine, maybe by saying that they're going to expose themselves to false teaching, or that they're not necessarily trained to distinguish the doctrine from the Scripture, and that really is up to the leaders that have gotten the training. Now to jump into the idea of hell. Honestly, from what I've heard, it almost seems like heaven is more focused. But you're the expert here, so I'll defer to your expertise. I know that Mormonism tends to put hell as just the bottom layer of heaven. So even if you go to hell, you're the damned sinner, it ain't bad. Yeah, it's like the top row of detention in prison. You still get TV and free meals and things like that. So even at the bottom rung, it's not terrible. It's a pretty good place. That's the only doctrine of hell I know of within a cultish group. I really don't know of any other doctrines of hell that I've ever heard. I've heard more about heaven than hell from cultish groups.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard too much on other hells either. There is the concept of one's personal hell, where you go down to hell, and whatever your worst fear or whatever is, you have to spend an eternity with that. But other than that, yeah, I'm not really familiar with too many other concepts of that place.
Okay, and to dive into kind of what Joel was mentioning about the Mormons, for example, they believe in 3 levels of heaven, essentially, and Joseph Smith said that, if you could see even the lowest level of heaven, you'd kill yourself right now to get there. But they do have a concept of hell that's reserved for the devil and his angels, but the addition to that is that the other people it's for are ex-Mormons. Everybody else is going to reach a level of heaven, but the Mormons who abandon it will get this special place in hell as well.
Dang, bro!
Yeah, I know, right? So it's very much a method of controlling people. And I think you're also right. A lot of cults don't focus on hell. They either reserve it for a very specific group, or they have it as something that's really put in the background or removed from their theology entirely. New Age cults and mind science cults, they kind of fall under the same umbrella, focus on personal hell. It's very much what's personally worse for you, and you can find a way to avoid this if you put your thoughts in the right mind frame. So, very much so, though, there's this reward and punishment system in place that's all based on what you're doing and are you doing enough. And this is present, across the wide spectrum of cults. Now, this kind of, again, you jumped ahead of me just a little bit with things, Joel, but once we have people, we need to keep them away from outside influences and make sure that they only read the Bible through the eisegetical lenses that we give them. So they're not reading the Bible to look at it and see what it really says. Through the background we've given them to look at it. And that's really a key in how they control all of this, is there's no outside teaching you can go to. Your teaching are all from within the organization, so that, you can't get free thought involved. You can't have a disagreement with your leaders without being excommunicated or being reprimanded for taking on a different belief than the rest of the organization. And we see that the witnesses in particular are very well versed in this. They put out weekly Bible studies that dive in depth, but even in their meetings, the question and answer aren't discussion questions. They are question and answers where the question is read and then the answer is read as a point of teaching. It's not a question for people to really think about and consider possible conclusions. It's a straight up reading of the answer to the question, and this is what you believe now. So it's really that controlling that whole realm of thought in a way that will keep people contained. And to make kind of the long story short, as we look at some of these cults, what we want to do in starting a group like this is control what people think, see, hear, and feel. And this, in turn, will lead to controlling their perceptions, their thoughts, and their behavior. Really controlling kind of every element along the way. And so, as I cautioned at the beginning, I want people to consider whether your thoughts, your perception, and your behavior is being controlled by any group you're a part of. If so, it's worth considering are they in the sense that you've been taught. Because if it's only within this sphere of teaching within the group, you may want to consider putting on fresh eyes and looking at things a little more objectively, just to give it a chance. And trust me, Scripture can hold up to the scrutiny of looking at it with fresh eyes. And so it's worth considering if you're part of a group where it's really controlling these behavior and thoughts and feelings. And just to kindly briefly touch on a few groups that I think are maybe not all cults, but are certainly veering in that kind of way in terms of their actions. And you guys can feel free to chime in at any point on these. But in addition to the Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, things I would classify under the Christian cult label, because at least leaning that direction in some way, shape, or form, they're losing sight on the gospel, and they're focusing on controlling people's behavior and thoughts. Christian Science, which was started by Mary Baker Eddy, kind of another one of those early 1900s cults that really kind of led into a lot of the New Age and New Thought we see from groups like the Unity Church of Practical Christianity, which is extremely far from being actual Christianity, as it's just a New Age group. The Word of Faith movement and prosperity gospel also come out of this, and they certainly have very charismatic leaders, as well as a lot of these other elements we talked about. I think it was Joel that briefly touched on what we would call kind of the new apostolic reformation, which are these hyper-charismatic churches where it's really about an experience and what you're feeling and thinking versus the gospel. And we also see a veerance kind of off the other way, where it's about rules and it's about controlling things, with groups who kind of adopt that quiverful movement and a lot of what would fall under the new independent fundamental Baptist now, people like Stephen Anderson, who is very charismatic in his own way to people. But the teachings of these groups would definitely fall under this thought and behavior control within a lot of these groups. And, it doesn't always necessarily appear obviously a cult from the beginning. Just like with Jim Jones, it certainly didn't always show all these tendencies of a cult that we can kind of see with hindsight. But it developed that way. So these are kind of warning markers along the way as well.
Well, I'm sure all three of us see this meme from atheists that, I don't need the reward of heaven or the fear of hell to motivate my good behavior. And so they have this sort of reward-punishment idea of how Christianity works, that we only behave ourselves because we're afraid of hell and we're looking forward to heaven. And right. It almost seems like this is kind of the motivation, well, one of the things that the cults do to sort of shape behavior. Now, Caleb, you and I sort of have a background in psychology, so we both know the kinds of things that you do to shape behavior, sort of the reward, punishment, kinds of things, that sort of a Skinnerian method of shaping behavior. When you think about it, these cults are very sophisticated in the kinds of techniques they use to shape the behavior, and it really flows back to these techniques that we know from psychology and behavioralism. And one of these things is the heaven and hell thing. It's probably why they stress these things. And then another is social reward, that here you have a family, you have a culture, you have a place where you belong, and if you were to ever violate, you would lose that belonging, which is a big deal. I mean, that's something that speaks to human needs, is that you want to belong in some place. And, I'm sure if I dug into it, you'd find a lot of these other techniques that are standard for kind of a Skinner approach to behavioral shaping. So, yeah, and then if you contrast that with more of an orthodox Christianity, there's sort of a freedom from this kind of control. Each individual is allowed to and encouraged to think and to follow the gospel, and encouraged to read their Bible and have a personal sort of prayer life and everything, so that yes, we have a community of believers, but as individuals we are allowed and encouraged to have our own faith, work out our own faith, and really read the Gospels and come to our own conclusions rather than following a single charismatic leader.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think by a lot of times when we were referring earlier to fundamentalism, I think what you see where we could put fundamentalism in the way a lot of new atheists have referred to it, and cultish behavior would largely fall under a similar definition, even if not within their actual church, within their home structure. A lot of times you see the home being run in largely a cult kind of way. So I think those definitions have blended so much that many people can't separate that freedom in Christianity from what is classified as fundamentalism, when it's really more of these cultish control behaviors that are being implemented.
Okay, so you were talking about fundamentalism earlier. I really hate to... I wish I had a different word to describe that, because our member, Mark Lambert, really wants to bring back fundamentalism as defined by going back to the fundamentals and embracing the fundamentals, which is a good expression. It used to be what fundamental meant, but unfortunately I don't have another word to describe the sort of dogmatic, almost controlling approach that now defines what we call fundamentalism. But at any rate, speaking of that, you see so often in the history of the church this sort of constant splitting off of various denominations over in retrospect were relatively minor, certainly not core teachings that would involve our relationship or our salvation. Very minor things like paedobaptism, or how often during the week you have to do the communion, or obviously the one that we always come back to is creationism. And these very minor things in retrospect become these things that they break off. Well, why do they do that? They do it because you're not allowed to question the teachings of that church. You have a leader or a panel, and you have this church tradition that goes back a while, and if you were to even question it or come up with alternative ideas, any kind of questioning whatsoever is tearing out one brick that holds up, one card that holds up the castle of cards and tears the whole thing down. So, yeah, I mean, that almost leans in the direction of cultism, although I hate to use that word to describe these traditional churches going back.
Right, and I think what you're touching on is important, that our definitions, again, have been twisted within culture. And while Christians understand what's meant by fundamentalism in our own circles, and a lot of us would agree with that, that word is used so differently from the outside for these other goals within churches people came from. So I think that's a really good distinction, and I think if it were to kind of leave people with some hope from all this, is that the best vaccination we can actually have against Christian cults that pop up is a solid understanding of what the Bible actually teaches, which is, as I'm sure Mark or you would probably describe it, that is what we mean. But it's when we let these other things as teaching points and let charismatic leaders take control in a way that veers away from what the Bible actually teaches into something that can become very dangerous and deadly for a lot of people. It's difficult, but we have to reach out to people within these groups and do the best we can in the love of Christ, and we want what's best for them. And that's why I have such a passion for kind of cult ministry, is because these people are in a dangerous situation oftentimes, and the gospel is what the core of our faith is. It's not any of these secondary issues. It's the gospel is what's the core.
Yeah, so let me ask you a question, if I could, real quick, before we wrap up this section. As someone who has studied the issue of cults, how do you feel is the best way to evangelize?
I have a personal bias there, but I've learned through trial and error a lot. I've went in with a very argumentative approach in the past and tried to show them where there were problems in their beliefs. It didn't work. What has worked has been building real relationships with people, using Greg Koukল's kind of tactics approach. Really ask what they believe, and that's how I've learned a lot of what I have about their beliefs, is by actually asking and digging deeper, and then asking questions that point back to what Scripture actually says. It draws a real distinction. For example, one question I utilize a lot with Jehovah's Witnesses is, okay, let's go through a 2-minute drill here. I've just been hit by a bus. What do I need to do to be saved from your perspective? And it gives a chance to really get to the core of, okay, what is their belief? And recently, after I'd asked these questions, I came back to the witness a few weeks later, and they actually asked me, well, okay, let's reverse this. What would, you say to me if I were hit by that bus? So it gave a clear opportunity to share the gospel. That was something I earned through a relationship and getting past those initial scripts that a lot of people in cults use. Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, the World Mission Society, Church of God, they use scripts, and you have to get people off script. And the only way you can really, truly do that is by building a relationship that's at least on a level where they're listening versus having their guard fully up.
Good stuff. Yeah, so basically it's more than just simply going in there and, giving the arguments, but it's more of a relational thing you have to build with them.
Yeah, pre-evangelism, in that relationship building, and in some of those discussions that lead up to that, you've kind of earned enough trust that they can let down a little bit of that guard that the organization has made them build up to avoid free thinking. All right.
We're going to go out on our usual advertisements, I suppose. The month of September now, so we've got the book of the month that we're going to be sending out. You can follow us on Twitter at Mentionables1, and you can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Mentionables1. Recommend doing that because we post content pretty regularly. We've been bumping up our updates on our YouTube channel. So I've made a couple of episodes on our YouTube channel recently, and we're going to try to keep on top of that. So we also have a secret podcast that we do just for our Patreon members. We're still working our way through my audio book, and I'm getting set to record a defense of the book of John. John's an interesting and challenging book because it's one of the ones that skeptics have the most problem with because it was written later than the others. And it's got a high Christology, meaning that it sort of equates Christ with God more than the other ones do. So you can see what my defense of that is going to be if you jump in and join our Patreon crowd. And we're going to continue bringing you good content on the podcast and YouTube channel and elsewhere. So we've been the Mentionables. Thanks for listening. Keep on mentioning.